Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We have a lot to talk about, and just down the road from us, a rally tonight by President Donald Trump, and he may be glad to get out of Washington if, as we'll talk about in just a minute, the political theater that unfolded yesterday at the White House as any indication, and the constant pressure on him with the threat of impeachment, all of which we're going to talk about in just a minute, might cause him to say, I'm ready to leave. And if that's not enough, yesterday the House voted for, rather overwhelmingly, 354 to 60, a resolution condemning the decision by the president to remove troops from Turkey. So I'll get into that in just a minute. There may be a need for the president to stand in front of a cheering group and feel like he has some friends. I remember President Harry Truman one time said that if you want to have a friend in Washington, D.C., get a dog, because sooner or later, even your friends might turn on you, and this might be the way the president interprets this. 354 members of the House of Representatives passing a resolution. By the way, let me just say, a resolution means nothing. It has no force of law. It's a way in which some people can vent, but not necessarily do anything significantly. But nevertheless, 354 to 60. No surprise there that all 225 Democrats that were there, and in just a minute I'll talk about one Democrat that's not there, Elijah Cummings, who just died. But nevertheless, 225 Democrats all voted for the resolution. But in, I think, what could be considered a surprise, 129 to 60 Republicans voted for it, 2-1. Yesterday you heard our interview with Representative Van Taylor. He voted for it. In case you're wondering where some people fall out, certainly Louis Gohmert, who's from the 1st District, voted against the resolution, but he was only one of 60 individuals in the entire House of Representatives that did not vote for it. And on the other hand, when you look at Republican leadership, many of these people have been on the program with us. Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy voted for it. Steve Scalise voted for it. Matter of fact, later on, he was on with Lou Dobbs, who was criticizing him for voting for it. Then Conference Chair Liz Cheney, national security experts Mac Thornberry's been on the program with us. Again, the former chairman of the Armed Services Committee before that. And then even the top foreign affairs Republican Michael McCall's been on with us. All of those individuals, including Marine veteran Michael Gallagher and others, all voted for the resolution. So this was certainly something that only has, if you will, symbolic nature to it. But nevertheless, I think illustrates again some of the tension right now being felt by the White House, because on the one hand, the drumbeat for impeachment seems to be getting stronger. The argument, even from this political theater, which I'll get to in just a minute, arguing that the president is unstable, is something. And even friends of Donald Trump, because I can't say that I've ever even met him, but others have said, you know, this might really cause an average person to crack. This would certainly cause even somebody who's been under withering criticism for years to crack. And there are some people in Wall Street starting to ask the question, what would happen if the president were to step down? Even if he's impeached by the House of Representatives, that would go to the Senate. The Senate, there's no way you can come up with a way in which, at least I can think of right now, that he would be removed from office. So it's just a long, tedious process leading nowhere other than of course, if you will, the stigma of having been one of the few presidents in history that were impeached. But nevertheless, that is something that we might want to talk about as well. Let me get to this whole issue of Turkey for just a minute, because it is essentially a toothless resolution. It shows disapproval. And the argument being made from the White House right now, which I think is a pretty weak argument, is that you have what is called the authorization for the use of military force. Now, that has been given to the president, starting all the way back with George W. Bush to Barack Obama, now Donald Trump, to deploy troops against responsible terrorist and associated forces. Okay, kind of hard to argue that either ISIS is one of those because it's been destroyed, or Al-Qaeda, which doesn't really in any significant way exist. So there is a sense in which that has always been a little bit of a weak justification, but hey, Congress has been willing to go along with that. Political analyst David Harsanyi said it this way: if you want to stop Donald Trump from making unilateral decisions regarding war and peace, then stop letting all presidents make unilateral decisions about war and peace. It's really quite that simple. And so Congress likes to have kind of these show votes, and this is a show vote. It says, we disapprove of you, Mr. President. We disapprove of the policy that you have of withdrawing troops. The Washington Times editorial board put it another way: if Congress is so adamant that U.S. forces should be fighting in the Syrian civil war, then Congress should vote to declare war. And if you're waiting for that, you're going to wait a long, long time. After the break, I might get into a little bit more of some of the comments by the president, but before I kind of explain maybe why the president made this decision, he didn't exactly encourage people that might want to support him. At one point, he talked the Middle East is just a lot of sand they can play with. Well, that really helps make your case, doesn't it? Or that we have a situation where Turkey is taking land from Syria and Syria is not happy about it. Let them work it out. It shouldn't be over there. Yeah, if it only were that simple. You know, Victor Davis Hanson, who we've had on the program before, talks about the fact that this is very complicated because, after all, we have Turkey as a NATO ally. Like it or not, they're part of NATO. We have Syria, where we have limited vested interest. And I think there is a very good argument to be made, and I've seen a few people make it. Gary Bauer mentions that. I'm reading from a piece here where Mark Alexander makes it as well, that it's quite possible that Turkey maybe even gave advance notice to Donald Trump saying, we're going to come across the border to hit the Kurdish PKK and YPGs. Groups that are oftentimes identified as semi-terrorist groups. And I'll leave that as it is because I wouldn't call them a terrorist group, but okay, certainly Turkey doesn't like them. And maybe gave them advance notice, recognizing the president that he is right now having advisors that would be in the line of fire, not wanting that to heat up as any kind of Middle East war or justification for war. Maybe realize that whether I keep the troops there or withdraw those troops, Turkey's coming in, better to avoid loss of life and remove them. And Gary Bauer raised something that hadn't even occurred to me until I read it. NATO has access to a lot of our nuclear weapons, which were used originally in Turkey to be a threat and a deterrence against the Soviet Union. Well, they have our weapons. They have access to our nuclear weapons. They are a NATO ally. And who knows what other kinds of threats beneath the surface actually took place. So if nothing else, we have a vote on the issue of Turkey and Syria. When we come back, I want to just make a few more comments real quickly about this because it turned into kind of a catfight or a theater. Or some people said a few of the members of Congress walked out like schoolyard children. And the reason they did was apparently Donald Trump referred to Nancy Pelosi as a third-rate politician. As one commentator said, maybe he actually said a third-grade politician because it was just like something out of the third grade. Well, we'll get into that, talk about some of the mistakes that in terms of public relations were made, and then move on to many other issues in the news. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In my commentaries, I often refer to the millennial generation, but what does the term millennial really mean? According to John Quiggin, millennial means nothing. That's the title of his op-ed in the New York Times. He is onto something. Some social commentators make broad statements about a particular cohort of people, baby boomers, baby busters, or millennials, and as we know, for any general rule, there are bound to be exceptions. That is why he rejects what he calls the generation game. That is the insistence on dividing society into groups based upon birth year. When I wrote a book years ago on baby boomers, and when I speak at various venues today about the millennial generation, I always talk about the fact that the trends we see are general rules. I even say that if you know millennials, you may notice that the trends I'm talking about don't necessarily apply to them. If you are a millennial, you may say some of the trends don't apply to you. Once we have this disclaimer, it then seems fair to at least notice general trends within a generation. After all, people born in the 1950s grew up in a time of unprecedented economic expansion. Young people born after the year 2000 grew up in a time when America was at war with terrorists. Even though there are important differences within a particular generation, they all have some common social experiences. And I believe that one factor that really binds a generation together is the shared technological experiences. Computers, the internet, video games, and smartphones have had a profound influence on the millennial generation and the following generation, often called iGen. In many ways, the common experience unifies a cohort like never before. That is why I'm not ready to say millennial means nothing. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, and we're going to get into a couple more issues about Turkey. We're going to then look at the issue of impeachment, and then what about this idea of maybe looking at various institutions that benefit from tax exemption? Would that even be a possibility? Sure, it was floated by one presidential candidate whose candidacy is going nowhere, but is that a possibility? So I do want to get into some of those issues, and it kind of relates to our first article by Kevin Williamson, O'Rourke's America, because even though a lot of people want to just say he's the outlier, he's maybe saying things that are not helpful, in just a few minutes, if we have time, I want to get into why there's probably going to be more pressure if indeed there is a Democratic president in the Oval Office 2 years from now. A lot of pressure to reevaluate tax exemption because there will be such a need to try to raise revenue. Yes, you have the argument being made, which not even fellow Democrats accept, that Elizabeth Warren would only increase the tax rate of an additional 2 cents on a dollar for very wealthy people. But we all know that some of the money is there, but a lot of the money is in the middle class because that's where most of the people are. And so that's one issue. But if you want to try to avoid some of the kind of tax increases that would be necessary for many of the plans that Elizabeth Warren or another Democratic president would want to have, one of the other sources of revenue is to remove tax exemption and to see. Of course, they have a devastating impact on nonprofit groups, but that pressure might be enough because people would rather lose the tax-exempt status of some of these groups than to have to pay more in their own taxes. So we'll get into that in just a few minutes. But this whole issue of the vote
on Turkey comes back to the fact that the president now has really been trying as much as possible to justify his argument that indeed this is something we need to do. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, the argument that we have forces there in the first place is based upon an authorization for the use of military force that really was only applied to fighting terrorists. And this is a Syrian civil war for sure. And so then he's really wanted to try and gone out of his way many times to vilify the Kurds. For example, he said the PKK, which is part of the Kurds, as you know, is probably worse at terror and more of a terrorist threat in many ways than ISIS. This is where, even at this point, I don't care if you're the greatest supporter of this president and you've been actually outside the American Airlines Center for 2 days waiting to cheer him on, if you know anything about the Kurdish people, to know that this PKK group may be not the nicest group, and it's not exactly the Chamber of Commerce, but it is hardly more dangerous than ISIS. And so these kinds of statements being made by the president, of course, are typical. It's a light switch on, a light switch off. If he likes you, then it's the greatest and the best and the most significant. And if you are his enemy or you're perceived his enemy, you're the worst, and you're a worse terrorist group than ISIS. There is no reason to make a statement like that. And again, let me move on, because there were some other questions that people were asking about why indeed is the president digging in his heels so much. And a lot of that took place yesterday when there was a meeting between the president and congressional leaders. And apparently it descended into what most people call political theater, or looking like something you've seen in grade school, in which Pelosi and others walked out of the room, Steny Hoyer and others, and conveniently the microphones were already there. Since they supposedly walked out early, why were the microphones there? I mean, I know they sometimes set up somewhat early, but it's almost like they signaled that we're going to go in there, we're going to shout at him, he's going to shout back, and we're going to walk out. It was almost like it was predetermined. But nevertheless, Nancy Pelosi goes out there and said that Donald Trump had a meltdown. And she then, you've seen the pictures, at one point stands up and he refers to it apparently as a third-rate politician. And as a result, they were saying he's unhinged. And then she sort of patronizingly said, well, I pray for the president all the time. Now we have to pray for his health, because this is a very serious meltdown on the part of the president, which, of course, fits exactly the meme that they're looking for right now to say, this is why we need to impeach this man, because he's just completely lost touch with reality. He's having a meltdown. He's making all sorts of mistakes. And so as a result, we just have to do what we can to remove him from office. And so that's why I think some of that was political theater. But again, you can watch some of the ways in which this was covered yesterday by the press and come to your own conclusions. One other thing that unfortunately feeds into this is there was a letter that was posted, which was at first assumed to be another thing from the Babylon Bee or from Onion or something like that, because it looked like an official letter from Donald Trump to the Turkish president, Erdogan. And you started reading it and thinking, no, this has got to be a joke. And then the White House said, no, it's really, really true. And that's when you start going, this is just amazing. This is an official letter from the President of the United States to the President of Turkey, in which I'll just read one or two quotes that kind of got my attention. History will look upon you favorably if you get this done the right and humane way. It will look upon you forever as the devil if good things don't happen. Don't be a tough guy. Don't be a fool. Then later on it says, let's work out a good deal. You want to be responsible for slaughtering thousands of people. I don't want to be responsible for destroying the Turkish economy, and I will. I love this. Don't be a tough guy. Don't be a fool. I mean, these are phrases that I don't think previous presidents have used as they have communicated with other presidents, but nevertheless, that is another part of the ongoing issue and saga that is unfolding. Which brings me to the next point before we take a break, and that is there is more and more evidence that indeed there will be a vote on impeachment. Now, first of all, let's be honest and fair. The previous times when we've had impeachment hearings, of course, one in the 19th century, and 2 in the 20th century, one with Richard Nixon, one with Bill Clinton. Nixon resigned before the vote for impeachment took place, and of course Bill Clinton stayed and the vote took place. But all of this was public testimony. As I shared the other day, some of us can remember with some level of interest watching the testimony of John Dean, for example, against the issue of Richard Nixon and what happened during Watergate. Some of us can remember Ken Starr being cross-examined, and yet you have not seen any of that on television, have you? Because it's all been behind closed doors. But nevertheless, let me just read this article. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell told Republican senators yesterday to be ready for an impeachment trial of the president as soon as Thanksgiving, as the Senate began to brace for what might indeed take place. And an air of inevitability has taken hold in Congress, with the expectation that Trump will become the third president in history to be impeached, and that Republicans need to prepare to defend the president. Well, Mitch McConnell briefed senators on what would happen during a Senate trial. Republican leaders in the House conveyed what they expect to be regular impeachment strategy sessions. And in a closed-door weekly luncheon, Mitch McConnell gave a presentation about the impeachment process, fielded questions alongside his staff, and Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham, who is, of course, a Republican from South Carolina, who was a manager for the 1998 impeachment of President Bill Clinton. So at least in that sense, we have at least one skilled hand in that regard. And, of course, this particular article is on to remind us that if nothing else, impeachment is just the first step to remove a president, with the House voting on formal charges. We haven't seen any of those yet. And the Senate then holding a trial in which it either convicts or acquits him. And Mitch McConnell made it very clear that the Senate might meet 6 days a week during the trial. Again, one of those little secrets that most people don't know is lots of times if you can get the Senate to meet 3 days in a row, you're really doing pretty well. 6 days in a row would be helpful, if for no other reason, because this is going to be a terrible distraction. As we come to a break, let me just remind you that if it goes to the Senate, then the Senate convenes like a jury. Now, there may be times when members of the Senate would have to leave for this or that, maybe could have a few committee meetings, but realistically, it is something that takes a lot of time. It takes everybody's time, and if it isn't bad enough that it bottles up the United States Senate, it essentially bottles up the United States Supreme Court, because the Chief Justice, in this case it would be John Roberts, would have to sit there like a judge in that case. And back when this was the 18th century, early part of the 19th century, that wasn't a big deal. With all the cases right now the Supreme Court has to address, this would not only bottle up everything in the Senate, it would probably bottle up everything in the Supreme Court. And I doubt very little would happen in the House. So it would be tremendous theater. It would be interesting. And it would go nowhere, because I think most people seriously doubt whether or not the president would be removed from office. But that's what they're planning for. We'll talk more about some of these other issues right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Of course, we've talked about the Trump rally tonight, and if any of you happen to be listening right now and like to call in and are waiting to get into the American Airlines Center, give us a call. Of course, we also have talked about this resolution, which has really gone the wrong direction for the president, but I think expresses where just a number of Americans are. Should we pull out? And this is not a surprise, by the way. The president is certainly one that has talked about getting us away from and out of meaningless wars. He has stuck to many of his promises, and whether you like this president or not, I think even his critics have to begrudgingly admit that he's kept his promises. I will be in Israel in a couple of days, and I'm hoping to take a picture in front of the embassy in Jerusalem, which used to be in Tel Aviv. There's a good example of that. And, of course, so many other things that the president has said. A little bit later in the third hour, we're going to be talking with Eric Metaxas. He's written a book about Donald building the wall. Now, it's a children's book, but again, we can talk about the various things the president said on the campaign trail, and he made it very clear that he did not want to keep our military actually deployed continuously in meaningless and frustrating and expensive wars, and he will probably address that tonight when he speaks at the American Airlines Center. So that is one of those things that when many people voted for him, they knew that we wouldn't probably like everything he was going to do, and that certainly fits into that category. And a lot of the Republican leadership voted for the resolution, which is at least a little bit of a rebuke against the policy the president has implemented. While we're talking about Congress for just a minute, many of us today have heard about the death of Elijah Cummings. Now, here is the man, it is the chairman, or was the chairman of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, a frequent critic of the president, by the way, and I love what some people have said. Did we even know he was sick? Because, okay, he had not participated in a roll call vote since September 11th. And he had undergone a medical procedure, but all of a sudden we say, he's not alive, he died. 68 years of age, as I am almost that age myself, that sounds a lot younger than I would have thought. I didn't realize that was his age, but nevertheless, here is an individual that has been a very strong critic of the president who will not be there. He has, of course, been the chairman of a very important House committee. And then now, as I understand, under Maryland law, the governor, Larry Hogan, will have to set some kind of dates for a primary election and then maybe a special general election to fill the vacancy. And so that has to happen within a little more than a month. I think he's got 36 days. This is a district, by the way, that is definitely a Democrat district. So the idea that a Republican could win that and change that is extremely unlikely. But nevertheless, just wanted to acknowledge the passing of Elijah Cummings. None of us even knew he was sick. I mean, for a long time, we knew John McCain was sick and maybe even dying. But all of a sudden, this one, I think, caught most of us off guard, and just thought I would mention that today as well. But our first article that we have posted, and I may come back to it in the third hour, but you probably will not have a chance to hear that unless you are listening online, is a piece by Kevin Williamson entitled O'Rourke's America. And first of all, he says that in some respects, some of these progressives want to turn America into an airport. When I first read that, I said, where's he going with this? Well, he says the airport is a totalitarian environment where Americans are disarmed, stripped of their privacy, divested of their freedom of speech, herded around like livestock, bullied by agents of security, and goes on. And if you've been at an airport, and I will be even tomorrow, then we know exactly what he is talking about. And so the argument is that with all these statements being made by Beto O'Rourke, it sounds like that, because later in the article he says that former Representative O'Rourke proposes to gut the Bill of Rights, beginning with the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, and then to stick the federal snout, he says, into America's bedrooms and churches anywhere he detects a scent of nonconformity. And the argument is that when you talk about, for example, even the issue of the Second Amendment, the call for getting rid of so-called assault weapons or weapons that are scary looking, he points out that these long guns, and long guns is the category used by the FBI to explain everything from a rifle to a shotgun. So that's really much broader than these particular ones. But those amount to about 2% of the firearms used in violent crimes. I don't know that you can even break out those that are like ARs or AKs, but I suspect, given the fact that some people use shot-off shotguns and other rifles, it might be 1%. So we're not talking about a lot of it anyway. But the point is that whether you look at the Second Amendment or, now let's look at the First Amendment, again, Representative O'Rourke does not approve of the view that a few churches and Christian organizations take. So that is the idea then of having the IRS use the kind of tactics that the Obama administration used to use and actually begin to withdraw tax-exempt status. And so he says here, you notice a pattern emerging here. When O'Rourke encounters something that makes him uncomfortable, his instinct is always the same. Send federal agents to stick guns in somebody's face until he gets his way. And I love he puts in parentheses, and if you think the IRS is something other than a gun in your face, try declining to pay your taxes for a few years, and you'll know exactly what we're talking about. And the point he's making is one that we made earlier yesterday, and that is, if you think that Beto O'Rourke is just the outlier, he's the exception, it's certainly not a view held by others. And then Kevin Williamson goes into some detail, and I won't take too much time with it, to simply say that totalitarianism is on fashion in the left. That is, Democrats have turned such familiar proposals as health care subsidies for the poor to the abolition of private health insurance, a measure endorsed by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, among others. Democrats no longer are content to impose confiscatory taxes on income, but now propose, here again Sanders and Warren, to seize American savings, confiscating their property rather than merely levying their income. And so he gives some examples of the fact that this is certainly kind of the, if you will, almost the totalitarian impulse that is taking place right now. And it's coming from individuals who maybe are frustrated that they can't seem to get Congress to do some of this. So they're running as president, hoping that since they saw how the previous president could, with his phone and his pen, do some very significant things, that maybe we can just simply have the IRS, the Justice Department, the federal government, and a variety of others implement these policies unilaterally without having to deal with this long, important discussion about whether or not some of those policies even make sense, who's going to pay for them, what are going to be the penalties, and the rest. And so it brings us back to this comment that was made by Beto O'Rourke. And it was interesting that he made that on Thursday. And, of course, a few hours later, most of you probably saw my commentary that came out on October 11th. And that one was not related to Representative O'Rourke. It was related to what had already happened in Congress, because the Ways and Means Subcommittee actually had met on the subject of how the tax code subsidizes hate. And their definition of hate is pretty broad because they use the standard use, and that comes from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which not only over the years has, I think, rightly identified hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan, white supremacists, and others, but then when there aren't that many groups and wanted to still stay relevant, began to then say anybody that said anything negative about homosexuality, well, then they are a hate group as well. And that adds to the groups things like the American Family Association, the Family Research Council, Alliance Defending Freedom, and the rest. And the point I was making back just a week ago is that we're in a situation right now where in Congress, and now with at least a couple of presidential candidates, there's a willingness to look at, or in one case, a presidential candidate actually remove the tax-exempt status of various groups. And if indeed we do elect one of these presidential candidates that wants to spend a lot of money, there isn't any money out there. And so that money is going to have to come either by really taxing the rich, which might work for about a year or two until the rich give up and say they're going to move or they'll shelter their income, and then eventually taxing the middle class, which is going to lead to all sorts of backlash. So another source of income could be simply removing the tax-exempt status of all sorts of groups that are perceived, at least by them, as unfavorable, or maybe just removing the tax-exempt status of all these groups in order to just simply meet the budgetary obligations of the federal government. We might talk about that a little bit later because Jerry Tuma will be with us. And, of course, we'll also be talking about that later with Eric Metaxas. We've got a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention that at the top of the hour, we're going to have in studio with us Jerry Tuma, and we have a new cornerstone report, Don't Fight the Fed, and we'll talk about Federal Reserve, we'll talk about interest rates, we'll talk about investments, we'll talk about China as well, because the trade war with China was one of the things that was keeping investors from investing because of the uncertainty. It was hurting farmers, and maybe even hurting consumers. That seems to be at a truce at the moment. So what does that mean? So we'll talk about some of those financial issues with him and just give you a chance to ask some questions. So you feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. And then in the next hour, Eric Metaxas will be with us. We'll be talking about his children's book for a few minutes, Donald Builds the Wall, but mostly we'll just get into his thoughts about the Democratic candidates, the Democratic debates, the future for the re-election of the president. He's actually met with Donald Trump. I never have, so I'd like to get his comments and perspective on what's been taking place there. And again, as an author, talk show host, certainly going to be a great opportunity to chat with him as well. Just before we take a break, though, I do want to quote from this very important piece that comes from a Democratic strategist. This is Michael Starr Hopkins. He has worked on the presidential campaigns of Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and even more recently, John Delaney. And the title of his piece is Democrats Have Reason to Worry After the Last Presidential Debate. And he said if Democrats want to beat President Trump in 2020, and he does, I mean, he's a Democrat, he's a strategist, he may know more about the political environment than almost anybody because he's worked on all these campaigns and been around for a long time. But he says, again, if Democrats want to beat Donald Trump in 2020 and return a sense of normalcy to the White House, they may want to make sure the current frontrunners are up to the job at hand. Winning a primary, he says, is one thing, but winning a general election is a completely different beast. He spends a little bit of time in this piece talking about the fact that the last two times Democrats have nominated liberal Democrats from Massachusetts, it has not gone very well. We're thinking of Michael Dukakis running against George Herbert Walker Bush. We're thinking about John Kerry running against George W. Bush. Both of them running against a different Bush, but nevertheless, he really points out that Elizabeth Warren, he says, could potentially be the best candidate and the worst candidate to take Trump on the general election all at once. She is clearly thoughtful, extremely smart, prepared to lean into the historic movement and all those kinds of things. She has yet to find her voice or ability to create a likable narrative that will drive apathetic Democrats to the polls on Election Day. So skipping down a paragraph or two, he says, of course, this is kind of what scares him. The weakness of Michael Dukakis and the weakness of John Kerry, he said, was not rooted in their policy proposals. It was rooted in their inability to connect with voters who had different life experiences. Whether it was a person of color or a blue-collar worker, both Dukakis and Kerry failed to connect. The current field cannot afford to make the same mistake. Okay, I might disagree a little bit about their policies. Some of their policies were at issue. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that because President George W. Bush, running for re-election, supported the idea of a marriage amendment, and because it was on the ballot in Ohio, it turned out lots of individuals that actually believe that marriage should be between one man and one woman. The lack of interest on the part of John Kerry made them think that he was going to support every LGBT kind of issue, and that not only kept any possible social conservative from voting for him, but I think it also kept a fair number of African-American voters who tend to oftentimes be churchgoers and blue-collar workers and others to do so as well. But nevertheless, maybe it was their policy proposals in part, and maybe he's right, the rest of it was their inability to connect. And I will, again, also admit that, as we've talked about before, Elizabeth Warren does have this ability, unlike some candidates, to actually mingle with the crowd, take selfies, and is pretty affable. But again, I think his point's well taken. A little bit later, he goes on to say that candidates like Beto O'Rourke and Cory Booker have failed to live up to their expectations and squandered their opportunities to turn their visions into tangible movements. Candidates like Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris have so far been unable to expand their base and build upon their name recognition to solidly get support. And it is amazing that you can read through this entire place, and I'm trying to think, I don't think the name Joe Biden ever shows up, other than just talks about a former vice president mired in a scandal. So he doesn't think that's even a possibility. So one of the people he doesn't mention, interestingly enough, is mentioned in another article in The Hill. It says Buttigieg emerges as a new threat to Biden after the debate. It's by Jonathan Easley and Amy Parnas. And interestingly enough, Their argument is that Joe Biden faces a new threat from the South Bend, Indiana mayor, Pete Buttigieg, I'll just call him Mayor Pete, simpler, who is fresh off an eye-opening debate performance and positioning himself to be a top contender for the support of centrist Democrats if the former vice president falters. I think you can kind of assume that. He has more than $23 million in the bank, compared to only about $9 million for Biden. And I mentioned just the other day, it's about $3 million for Beto, about $1 million for Julian Castro, to give you a little bit of a range there as well. And interestingly enough, the recent polls from Iowa show that he's on the rise. He's picked up a number of points, and now he would be in third place, interestingly enough, within striking distance of both Senator Elizabeth Warren and former Vice President Joe Biden. And so he's kind of stepped out as a fighter for moderate Democrats, feeling marginalized by the left, putting him, of course, in conflict with Biden, because that's kind of the position that he's held to as well. He clashed, of course, with Representative Beto O'Rourke over his mandatory gun buyback, and made a real point about saying, you know, I don't need a lecture about courage from you. I mean, after all, let's face it, Mayor Pete has actually served in the military, and so that is certainly the case. So it is kind of intriguing to see that a few things have moved. There were a lot of people that said, even though the Democrats may not like Joe Biden, he's still kind of the odds-on favor because we saw him as vice president. He represents something a little less radical. Whether this scandal continues, I don't know, but I just think that there are all sorts of other issues, even before we even heard the words Ukraine tied to him and his son. And so I think that one is out. So this is why, of course, back to the original piece I was reading from by Michael Starr Hopkins, I hope that our people are up to it, meaning, of course, he's a Democrat, and in particular thinking that maybe it's Elizabeth Warren, and will she connect, or will we have another situation in which we get a liberal, progressive Democrat from Massachusetts that fails to connect with the American people and then also goes down to defeat. So we will continue to watch that. But I thought it was interesting to see these two pieces coming out today in The Hill, which is, of course, the publication of record for Capitol Hill, looking at the campaign. And we'll see over the next few weeks how that plays out, how they do in the November debate. And, of course, it's always important to remind ourselves that, number one, the only poll that really matters happens a year from now in November, and that not one delegate has been selected either by a caucus or a primary. So as much as we are talking about who's up and who's down, it's based upon polls, it's based upon a fair amount of speculation, and that certainly could change. But there comes to be a point in time where as you get closer to the primaries, the individual with the money, the individual with name recognition, the individual with the grassroots support usually does win. And there have been very few surprises in that regard. Matter of fact, the most significant exception was in 2004. The person with the most money was not the one that won the nomination. John Kerry won the nomination, not Howard Dean. But that only changed quickly after John Kerry began to do a little bit better. In most cases, he who has the money, he who has the grassroots, he's or she is the one that wins. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. the Point of View radio talk show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View radio talk show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We have a lot to cover, and I might just mention that in studio with us is Jerry Tuma. We're going to get to that conversation in just a minute, talk about some of the financial issues. Next hour, Eric Metaxas will be with us, a New York Times bestselling author as well as talk show host. And we will, after that, get into some of the issues in the news. One of those, of course, the House voting in a resolution expressing disapproval of President Trump's withdrawal of troops from Syria. That vote was 354 to 60. No surprise that all the Democrats have voted for the resolution, but 129 Republicans did as well. So what's the significance of that? And former Representative Elijah Cummings, the reason I say former is he died, and so that he's been, of course, a very significant critic of the president, but also a major chairperson in the House of Representatives, and so that will leave a special election that will take place in Maryland, and so we have that conversation to take place, as well as is there a possibility that there will be a vote on impeachment? The Senate is already sort of gearing up for that. Mitch McConnell talking about the procedure they would go through if indeed this came to them, and they would even begin to hold that particular trial in the U.S. Senate before Thanksgiving and meet 6 days a week. So we'll get into all of that a little bit later. But I thought it would be helpful in light of what we've been talking about. As a matter of fact, our next issue of Outlook is on the subject of China. And one of the things that's transpired just recently is a truce, if you will, in the China trade wars. And so what does that mean? We also have some actions by the Federal Reserve that you need to know about. And this affects your family, it affects your finances, and a number of other things. So, of course, Jerry Tuma is a certified financial planner. He's the president and founder of Cornerstone Financial Services, which is a state-registered investment advisory firm right here in Dallas, Texas. And as we always say, material on this program is intended for general information only, should not be taken as specific investment, tax, or legal advice, for obvious reasons, because everybody is a little bit different.
You bet.
But, Jerry, let me just get to this. I have talked about this week, and I've been saying I've been looking forward to hearing from you because you were concerned, and I think all of us were rightly concerned, that eventually this trade war could really hurt people. It's been hurting farmers, soybean farmers right now will call and say, yep, that's exactly what's been doing to us. But it's also hurt investment, because if there's one thing that both Wall Street and Main Street don't like, it's uncertainty. And at least for the moment, we got a truce, don't we?
We do, and let's hope it takes at this point, because we need, those of us in the conservative party here, we need to have a president get reelected next year, and we're awful close to the edge right now. Kerby, if we had, all of the leading economic indicators have been pointing downward now for months.
Yes.
And so usually when you get this far in the cycle, recession is normally your next step. Now, right now, it is really close. What's going to happen the first part of next year? So we've got a certain amount of this is baked in the cake already. So there are lag times from policies. You can talk about lag times from trade policy. You can talk lag times about the Fed and the Fed's policies. These lag times, again, it's kind of like if you want to know where the train's going to go, you watch the engine on the train, not the caboose on the train. So the caboose right now is telling us everything's fine, like if you look at the unemployment rate. But the rate of job growth is slowing radically. The uncertainty as it affects businesses, we talk about a term called CapEx, where companies spend money to build factories or buy equipment or whatever. CapEx has tanked because the corporations are uncertain what's going to happen with China. China's economy is slowing significantly.
Yes, it is.
You know, it's been running about 6.5% a year annual growth. It's looking like it's more like 5.5% now and going down. People have stopped buying cars or slowed radically on car buying over there. That affects our oil industry. That affects automobiles. So everything right now is in big slowdown mode. So really what Trump needs, and I quoted one of our analysts that we got last week. He said that this trade deal truce might work, and he said he thinks, in his opinion, and I've seen every opinion under the sun on this deal, but he said he thinks that it's really might work this time for this reason. Or let's put it this way: they're gonna be heavily incentivized to do something. On Trump's side, obviously, he wants the economy to look as perfect as possible, as strong as it can by next November. Sam Stovall of Standard & Poor's has come up with an indicator, if you will, on elections. And he said, if you go back, I'm thinking like the last 40, 50 years, every time that the stock market is going down, the 90 days before the presidential election, the incumbent party loses. Almost universally. Almost no exceptions. Every time the market's going up the last 90 days before the election, the incumbent party wins. Now, Hillary was the last one that lost because the market was going down between July and the election, and Trump surprised everybody. So we got to have the market going up if we want Trump reelected. We got to have the economy recovering because it's slowing, even though on the surface it looks strong. If you just look, consumer spending still strong. Housing's making a big comeback because interest rates have been coming down. But the reason interest rates are coming down is because the bond market's been telling everybody, oh, no, there's a big slowdown happening and it could be a recession. And the issue really is not, are we going to have a recession? It's when are we going to have the recession? It's getting very close. Some of our best analysts saying first quarter of next year we could start one. If so, it'll be mild. At this point, the jury's out, and I'm not going to take a stance either way right now because I could predict it going either way. If we have one more negative thing that hits us, like let's say Iran goes overboard and bombs a whole bunch of more stuff in the Middle East and oil spikes, that's kind of tipping us over probably. That's the tipping point. At the same time, I'm hopeful that the combination of the trade truce, which is saying at least it's not going to get worse, and hopefully the worst of the sanctions will stop, and the Federal Reserve, is because we have a special report for people called Don't Fight the Fed. The Federal Reserve, excuse me for saying it this way, finally woke up. I'm like, come on, McFly, wake up here. They were tightening policy, and they've been doing it for 2 years, and they finally decided, oh, this didn't work. And there was an explosion, if you want to call it that, on the overnight lending market in the banking system, saying liquidity is too tight. Kind of like those of us that are a little older, like me and you, we remember the old days with the lawn sprinkler. You know, if you kink the hose of the lawn sprinkler, after a lag time, the water stops coming out. The Fed was really blowing it. The fact that they're reversing course may save us in time. So I think that there's still probably not going to be a big recession, maybe not a recession at all next year. That's my hope. But the good news is this truce is going to help a lot. And the Fed, assuming they continue, it's not as much about them cutting interest rates as it is pumping liquidity back in the system because, you know, we've had low interest rates for over a decade. People have had plenty of time to refinance their corporate structures or whatever. But the lack of liquidity in the system started showing up overnight in the banking system. The same thing happened in 2007 before the 2008 debacle. Let's hope the Fed got the message, and I think they did.
Well, let's take a break. But just since you mentioned that, I will hold this up for people to see. And, of course, we have that on the website. If you go to Cornerstone Financial, you will see the Cornerstone Report for October. And it is entitled Don't Fight the Fed. And I think it's about 6 pages. Mm-hmm. And so people want to get this. They're going to be finding themselves saying, okay, you're going to be covering a lot of that. Matter of fact, we really haven't even gotten into the report yet. But I've had people on this program before say that really one of the most important people, maybe the most powerful person in the world, is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, because they determine what is the interest rate, and that interest rates and all that affects so many other things. And so
it affects the whole world, too, not just the U.S.
So, again, a lot of people don't know a lot about the Federal Reserve. They don't know about some of the things taking place. And so that's why we're going to talk about that, because it affects you, your family, and your finances. So we'll continue our conversation with Jerry Tuma right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In my commentaries, I often refer to the millennial generation, but what does the term millennial really mean? According to John Quiggin, millennial means nothing. That's the title of his op-ed in the New York Times. He is onto something. Some social commentators make broad statements about a particular cohort of people, baby boomers, baby busters, or millennials, and as we know, for any general rule, there are bound to be exceptions. That is why he rejects what he calls the generation game. That is the insistence on dividing society into groups based upon birth year. When I wrote a book years ago on baby boomers, and when I speak at various venues today about the millennial generation, I always talk about the fact that the trends we see are general rules. I even say that if you know millennials, you may notice that the trends I'm talking about don't necessarily apply to them. If you are a millennial, you may say some of the trends don't apply to you. Once we have this disclaimer, it then seems fair to at least notice general trends within a generation. After all, people born in the 1950s grew up in a time of unprecedented economic expansion. Young people born after the year 2000 grew up in a time when America was at war with terrorists. Even though there are important differences within a particular generation, they all have some common social experiences. And I believe that one factor that really binds a generation together is the shared technological experiences. Computers, the internet, video games, and smartphones have had a profound influence on the millennial generation and the following generation, often called iGen. In many ways, the common experience unifies a cohort like never before. That is why I'm not ready to say millennial means nothing. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Such a privilege to have in studio with us Jerry Tuma, and I'll open up the phones, by the way, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, because there will be some of you that are going to say, well, what does this mean for my investment? I might have money in an IRA or a 401k, or I just got money in a savings account, or we've been thinking about buying a house. We've been talking about refinancing some of this. But before we get into the more practical stuff, let's cover this issue of the Federal Reserve. We've done many a program, Jerry, as you well know. You've been around for decades like I have. But let's explain again for some of our newer listeners what the Federal Reserve is, and then we're going to talk about how they're cutting interest rates and printing money and what that might mean for people and their investments.
Sure. The Federal Reserve was started in 1913, and the ostensible reason why they started it was to provide liquidity to the system in the event of a bank crisis or whatever type of crisis. Now, Milton Friedman was probably the most harsh critic of the Fed from what they didn't do in the crash of the Great Depression, 1929 to 33. Here, your express job is to provide liquidity in the event of a crash. And you all remember, It's a Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart movie, and they're running, the banks, and they're running up to the teller, give me all my money. Well, can't you just take just a little bit? Don't you remember? The money's not here in the bank. We keep 10% in the bank. The rest of it's loaned out to Joe's house, and it's Mary's house, and all that. And so that, he managed to come down to his last dollar, and he managed to survive a day. So the issue is the Federal Reserve, I know some people kind of take the view it's a malevolent organization owned by the Rothschilds, but that's technically not correct. I don't know exactly who all started it. I interviewed the guy that wrote the book from Jekyll Island, Creature from Jekyll Island, probably 30 years ago. Yeah. But it's owned by the Federal Reserve banks, 12 banks that are regional banks. Mm-hmm. They are trying to manage the economy. The problem is sometimes they're not good managers. They, like all humans, have their biases. And the biggest problem I've had with the Fed the last 2 years, Jay Powell, since he took over, we've just come through a great financial crisis. This was the worst crisis since the 1930s. It was a near depression. And we had what we call deflationary pressure, extreme deflationary pressure. And by the way, our book From Boom to Bust and Beyond, we talked about there would be a period of 3 to 5 years-ish, 2 to 3 years. I don't remember exactly what I said, but where you'd have intense deflationary pressure. You had a historic real estate bubble. That blew up. The banks were in trouble, kind of several stage crisis, had to bail out the banks and all that kind of stuff. But if we allowed that to continue, what Bernanke did when he was chairman of the Fed, he printed an enormous amount of money. At the time we'd written the book, it was probably under $1 trillion. It topped out at about $4.5 trillion. And the way they print it is they just go into their computer system and deposit money electronically into their system. Then they go to the banks and they buy government securities, or in this case, they also bought mortgage-backed securities. The goal was to reliquify the system because it's hemorrhaging on itself. You got bad loans, these subprime mortgage derivatives that the rating agency said were rated AAA, which turned out to be hocus pocus, and they kind of, one of them I know went from a value of 100 to 2. That's pretty AAA if you ask me, almost overnight. So the bottom line is Bernanke was probably the best student or teacher, if you want to call him that, about the Great Depression of anybody that lived on the face of the earth. So in my view, providentially, it's a good thing he was in the driver's seat when that all started. So he did what the guys in the 30s did not do, and he just pumped liquidity wave after wave after wave after wave. We call them quantitative easing. I think there was 5 waves altogether. And it restored balance to the system. It pumped the stock market back up. It kept the real estate from going, instead of going down 50%, well, maybe it went down 50, but it didn't go down 90 or 80 or 90 like the Great Depression. It turned the whole thing around. Now, when Powell took over, it looked like a good appointment by President Trump. He immediately decided to reverse that policy, and that's what the chart on page 1 of this special report talks about.
Right. There you go.
There we're showing the excess reserves in the banking system. If a bank keeps 10% of their money in reserve, okay, they have to have cash for withdrawals and checking account. People write checks and all that. Anything beyond the 10%, sometimes they can put it in what they call excess reserves, which they earn interest on or have been earning interest on until the recent changes. And so this was showing the excess reserves in the banking system, meaning there's a whole lot of excess liquidity sloshing around the system, which is a good thing. Again, the lawn sprinkler analogy, if you want a really green lawn, you want to fertilize, you want a lot of water in there. If you kink the hose and turn off the system, you got trouble. Well, he more or less kinked the hose. He said, okay, we're going to start taking liquidity out of the system.
Yeah.
I don't know why he did, and I'm a hard money guy in my original. I'm a free money market economic type guy, but the bottom line is my thinking was don't do this. We've just been through a horrific crash. At the end of the day, liquidity trumps economic momentum, and that's what we've seen since last year, Kerby. He kept taking money out of the system. It finally showed up. We had something called an inverted yield curve, which is very technical sounding. Basically means that short-term rates are higher than longer-term rates. The longer-term rates are governed by the bond market. They're telling you weakening is coming in the marketplace and the economy. The short-term rates are too high. Stubborn people are looking at the caboose on the train, whatever. And they nearly wrecked the whole ship. So what happened last fall when we had that mini meltdown in the market, we called it a mama bear market, if you remember.
That's right.
When that happened, it's like, okay, the market was telling the Fed, stop this, stop. You've gone too far. You're wrecking the ship. And that nearly happened. Well, it showed up in the overnight reserves. So overnight reserves should be priced at, what happens is if a bank, and I know I'm getting technical here, if a bank doesn't have enough in reserve at the end of the day, they have to borrow money from somebody else to make sure they get the reserve requirement. And that ought to be about 2.25, 1.75, whatever the current Fed funds rate is. It spiked to 10%.
Wow.
Well, what that means is there's a critical, acute shortage of liquidity in the system now. That's the only reason the rate spiked overnight. Well, so the marketplace, if you will, forced Powell to go, whoops, we're wrong, even though he still will not admit it, even though he still says it's not more printing press or quantitative easing. The bottom line is they started pumping money way back in the system again. I'm like, okay, we may have dodged a bullet. Let's hope we did, because we want Trump to get reelected and not the alternative Elizabeth Warren or someone like that, probably her. The bottom line is we've got to win the election next year, and if we torpedo the economy before the election, all bets are off. So the bottom line is the good news is they're reversing course on this thing.
But printing all that money, if I remember right, you have more money in the system for the same number of goods. That's called inflation. Now,
Right.
it may not turn out necessarily tomorrow, but it means that the dollars in your wallet, your pocketbook, your purse are worth less tomorrow than they are today.
And
right?
that's the true long-term outcome. In the more immediate run, basically there's kind of two factors on how inflation runs. One is the money supply, which is what you're talking about. How much printing press is in the system? How much money is out there? Because eventually, it's like if we had an auction. Let's say we had 100 people in this studio, which we can't squeeze 100 people in here, but let's say we did. We gave everybody $100 worth of auction money, and we have an auction with items. Now, rules are you can't combine your money with somebody else, so your max is $100. Then we haven't changed the number of items up for bid, but we run around and start handing everybody more auction money. So the maximum price, if you can't combine your your money with somebody else, is $100 in the auction. But if we give everybody $1,000 to bid with, now the maximum price is $1,000. So the prices of the products haven't gotten more valuable; the money's gotten less valuable, and that is the way inflation works in the long run. As you print more money. In the more shorter term, it's a combination of the amount of quantity of money in the system that you printed. Right. Times something called the velocity of money. How fast does it turn over in the system? And after everybody got scared to death, a near-death experience for the economy and their whole world, the velocity of money slowed way down. So it's kind of like trying to
bank, yeah.
It's like trying to start your car on a really cold morning, and it just it won't get cranked. That's starting to change, and that's one reason I think that the next decade is going to be a really high inflation decade.
Could be
a combination of all this stuff, but in the short run, it hasn't produced a lot of inflation in the short run.
Well, again, that's a little bit on the Federal Reserve. There's a lot more to that, and that's why we're making available this special report. And we're just encouraging you just to go to cornerstonereport.com, and you can sign up, get it, and sometimes I have to warn you that with some of the Jerry Tuma reports, you have to have a lot of paper in the printer. This one's just 6 pages, so This is easy to print out, and it's in color, but you can just do it on a black and white printer as well, and I think you will benefit from it. And again, if you want more information from them, there are phone numbers and emails and all the rest. But when we come back, let's start talking about what this means. A lot of people might say, okay, I'm not sure I follow this on the Federal Reserve. I've got investments, and I'm wondering what would be my strategy in light of the fact that we have, future inflation. We seem to have a pretty good economy at the moment with the truce on the trade war, and that looks good. And so just a couple of other implications about that. And since you've already mentioned Elizabeth Warren, I would get, before we're done here, some comments about that, because there are some individuals that have actually said, we supported Hillary Clinton, we supported Barack Obama, but these people on Wall Street that are Democrats saying, we don't think we will support Elizabeth Warren because of the things she said about corporations, which I thought was kind of interesting. So I want to come back and see what that might mean as well in terms of the political issues. But first, we want to just get real practical. So if you have some comments or questions, wondering about your investments or wondering about where to put your money, buy a house, refinance, feel free to give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212. And we'll be back with Jerry Tuma in studio right after this.
So when people first hear about Metashare, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Metashare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Metashare members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Metashare, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again in studio with us, Jerry Tuma. In about a half an hour, we'll also have our friend Eric Metaxas with us, as we'll be talking about some of the things in the news as well as his new book. And Jerry Tuma, of course, is a certified financial planner. We're going to maybe now give you some general ideas. You can contact him for specific plans. But one of those that comes to mind, Jerry, instantaneously is you're saying, okay, the possibility of recession either in the next year or the year after, it's getting pretty high. So
Right.
there's going to be a time where we've hit the top of the market. We're going to hit the crest, and there's going to be a little bit of a downhill.
Right.
There are people that have still listening to this program. I know, we'll talk to them, that say, well, I'll just hold on to my stock. I'll buy and hold. But you're holding it then when you're actually going downhill. You have always had a much different strategy, first of all, by looking at the trends, these demographic trends that a lot of various investment individuals miss. And second of all, you recognize that buy and hold is a really bad strategy, no matter whether you're 20-something or 60-something, really, isn't it?
Well, it's presuming the future. James chapter 4 talks about, don't say we're going to go in such and such a city and buy or sell, but say if the Lord wills. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And so the issue is, with a buy and hold strategy, you are assuming that, A, the stock market always goes up in the long run. But more importantly than that, and that's historically been true, it's been accurate, you can make the case that buy and hold makes more than other types of strategies, which it does at times, in the bull markets in particular. What you have to be careful, though, is when are the big bears. And we wrote a special report, which I think you guys got
Goldilocks
last
and the Three
year.
Bears.
Goldilocks and the Three
Yeah,
Bears.
he had a mama bear, but what about for someday getting a daddy
Exactly,
bear?
yeah. See, last year we had a mama bear. Mama bear, the S&P was down about 20%. Those you can usually recover from in a matter of months, which is what happened. But the daddy bears are more difficult. The daddy bears usually happen during recessions. The last two we had was in 2000. S&P 500 was down about 49% from top to bottom. And in 2008, which I make the case even in here, I mentioned, Kerby, that some of the things that happened in 2008 had sort of a once-in-a-lifetime element to them. I don't think they're going to recur. But the 2000 to 2002 bear market was a very mild economic downturn. It almost didn't even qualify. I mean, technically, a recession is 2 consecutive negative quarters for the economy, GDP. It was not even 2 consecutive quarters. It was 2 quarters. It was a very mild economic downturn, and yet the stock market went down 49%. So the issue here is, A, what are you willing to risk? And B, how long is your time horizon? If you're 25 years old and you're saying, well, I don't need this money until 40 years from now, and I'll just ride through it, and you keep buying, that's called dollar cost averaging. When the market goes down, you're buying shares cheaper. That can work real well. It still doesn't guarantee that you're going to make a profit. But the bigger issue, which really plagues a lot of people, and I have this feeling that somebody out there, or a bunch of people maybe, are listening to my voice today, are in this exact situation. They wait until their advisors say you always have to ride out every storm, which I don't believe. I do believe that there are other types of strategies that don't have to ride out the bear markets. In some ways, you can actually make money when the bear market hits. Most important is during the daddy bears, which we haven't seen since 2008. But again, if you are in retirement, what happens to a lot of people, the market's gone way up, like it's gone up since 2009. We've had a record bull market since 2009. And that's the time they decide, I got enough money in my account to retire on.
Yes.
And so what they do is they go,
yeah.
Here we go. All right, so I'm going to retire at the top of the cycle. I got plenty of money now. And then I'm going to leave it in the market on a buy and hold basis. Well, here's what historically has happened 2 times in the last 20 years. The market goes into a tanking. And it's not just the average return the market generates. If you're retired in particular, the sequence of your returns is hugely important. What I mean by that. So the market goes down 50%. Let's say you have some of your money in bonds, so your whole account goes down 30, for example. But if you're pulling money out for retirement while that's going on,
you're pulling out less money because it's going down.
Yeah, you're having to pull more shares out every day because it's going down. You might be down 50% before it's all over. Now I had $1 million in my retirement account. Now it's worth $500,000. Well, guess what, folks? At that point, you're kind of out of the game. What ends up happening is you end up having to go back to work because now you don't have enough cash to support the lifestyle that you're anticipating. And you'd be amazed at the number of people this happens to, because, again,
you've seen this in your own business.
I have seen it over and over again. People retire at the top of the cycle. They got plenty of money, and then the bear market takes out a bunch of their money.
Walmart. Yeah.
Yeah, and
I've seen it.
I got to do something new now, or start my own business or something. Because, again, at the top of the cycle, the emotions are always, we have joy, we get overconfident. Sometimes people take too much risk if they're more aggressive. And you have all these human behavior problems that hit at the top of the cycle. We presume the future. The market doesn't go up forever. There are bear markets that follow every bull without any exception. There are recessions that follow every recovery without exception. And so what historically happens is people get hit really hard. So the older you are, the more important it is to avoid the big bear markets. And I always use this analogy. If we had a Class 5 hurricane coming and we're on a cruise ship, let's say it's getting a little choppy and I'm taking some seasick pills right now, the captain of the ship could go one of two things. He could say, well, don't worry, folks. He gets on the loudspeaker in there and he goes, guess what? Storms always blow over in the long run. So we don't care. Just we're going to ride this storm out. We're heading right into the face of that Class 5 hurricane. Well, I don't know if that's the way you'd want to go. Or he could say there's a big island over here with a bunch of mountains. We're going to go around the other side of the mountain out of the wind, and we'll still get some chop, but we're not going to be wiped out. The problem is too many people take the first approach because they're always told there is no alternative. I do not in any way, shape, or form believe that there's no alternative to buy and hold, but that's my preaching for the day. I think that there's an alternative to it, and people should find out more about it.
You know, one of the other things is this is my booklet on debt, and you've got $1 trillion of credit card debt in America. You've got $1 trillion of car debt in America. You have $1.5 trillion of student loan debt. That wears me out before I even talk about house debt. And that's another thing, because this report that you have is about the Fed.
Yeah.
Now, if the Fed starts increasing interest rates, all of a sudden that means that you are paying a lot more for something that you already are indebted with. So
Right.
that's it's always good to get out of debt. But if you get the sense that the interest rates are going to go up, and I think they might.
Which in the long run they're going to. In the long run, I don't see any alternative to that. And one of the analysts we take said they were measuring interest rates overseas because we've only been around for a little over 200 years. But they said we're at 717-year lows on interest rates in Great Britain. Well, how much lower is it going to go from there? It's the next trend is going to be up for sure. So, and interestingly enough, all those debts you're talking about are compounding.
Yes.
So every year it takes more to service them than before, which is another reason if the Federal Reserve kinks the liquidity hose, you don't have enough flow into the system and you create a problem. Your engine blows. So that's what the Fed very nearly did. That's why we're asking people to get this special report and read it. Hopefully with the charts, you can untangle some of the technical jargon that we're trying to use or prefer not to use, but sometimes it's hard not to get some technical on this. But the bottom line is I think we're going to have a recession. If it doesn't happen the first half of next year, which is what I hope doesn't happen, almost certainly within the next 2 years, normally speaking, your really bad bear market, your daddy bears happen when the recession occurs. My guess is that's not now. I think that's probably around 2021 is my best guess right now. But again, depending on where you are in life, depending on how old you are, how much money you've got accumulated, you need to use that to determine your strategy and not just assume, because everybody always says, well, nobody can tell the future. And that's true to an extent. Apostle Paul said we see through a glass darkly, to use King James Version here. Bottom line is the future is not completely predictable, but it's not entirely unknowable either. There are a lot of things you can know, like you and I are big fans of the demographics. There are a lot of things you can know about the future. My thing is, I think that, and we talked about this in our book From Boom to Bust and Beyond, there'd be two phases to the crisis. Phase one, the ice phase is almost over. That's intense deflationary pressure, stocks crash, real estate crashes, etc. That's mostly over, except in Japan and in Europe for the most part. But the next phase, and even Alan Greenspan's running around the country telling everybody that the next decade is going to be big inflation like the 70s. That's when those credit card debts really come back to bite people because rates go up and up and up.
Also affects the federal government as well, because one of the things that the previous president, Barack Obama, had in his favor is he could spend a lot. And, of course, a lot of those shovel-ready projects turned out not to be shovel-ready, but nevertheless, he could spend a fair amount of money, run up the debts. But because the interest rate was low, that wasn't doing too much harm to the economy.
Right.
If now, with the accumulated debt from George Washington all the way now through Donald Trump, hits another percentage or two, a larger and larger and larger percentage of the federal government will be just paying interest on the debt. And
Right.
that is a problem that faces the next president, whether it's Donald Trump or whether it's Elizabeth Warren or whoever it might be. But those are at least possibles right now. So when we come back, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the political issues. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to just sit back, take some notes, or get a copy of the Cornerstone Report, we have information about cornerstonereport.com. You can get it there. And like I said, that's about 6 pages. You'll get a pretty good education on the Federal Reserve. And then if you find yourself saying, okay, what would that mean to me specifically? You have some 800 numbers here where people can call you or send an email. So let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We'll be with Eric Metaxas in just a little bit, and in studio with me for a few more minutes is, again, Jerry Tuma, who is, again, the president of Cornerstone Financial Services. And some of the materials are really intended for general information only and not specific investment or tax advice. But you did point out something that I think a lot of our listeners need to think about, and that is if you are near retirement age and saying, well, the economy is doing well, the stock market's doing well, then you need to figure out whether or not what happens 2 years ago won't be so well. And a buy and hold is not the idea, because then you'll have declining assets. You'll be taking money out of your retirement at higher percentages. And as you said, you've seen people, I think we all have, that all of a sudden thought they had enough of their retirement and had to go back to work.
Yeah, and that's the danger of the buy and hold mentality, especially as you get a little bit older. You can make it work. Again, I hate to say this, Kerby, this is something we want to pray against, but what happens in America if a nuclear terrorist event happens? Where's the bottom of the market that day? So that's things we don't want to think that way. But at the same time, you cannot presume the future. Again, that's what it talks about in James 4. So I take approach on it that there's times, kind of like in Ecclesiastes, there's a time to laugh, time to cry, time to plant, time to harvest, time for peace, time for war. In my view, there's a time to be in the market and a time to be out of the market. And personally, that's a whole lot more my style and my risk tolerance, personally.
Let's take some phone calls. And first of all, we'll go to Alaska, KJMP. Elmer, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Jerry Tuma.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. Since you mentioned the Fed and the Fed actions and the need for their policy management, I wanted to raise the question of monetary reform and how the banks create money. Or the private banking system, the banks creating the money rather than having some government, monetary authority that influences the creation of money. And so it kind of minimizes debt. I guess Iceland has a new plan since their debacle in the earlier part of the 2000s. I just wondered if you had any comments on monetary reform and that if you're familiar with the Iceland plan or the Chicago plan. I guess it's probably pretty far out there for a lot of people, but I just wanted to raise monetary reform.
Okay. Thanks, Elmer. I've not read up on those. My view right now is kind of this is the system we have. I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. The only way I could see them changing the system is if we have a complete catastrophe, which we very well could have. The bigger issue that I have in terms of where I think we're going, and I think Kerby and I are kind of on the same page on this, is the unlimited ability. In a crisis, you need the Fed to be able to print money because, again, back to the Jimmy Stewart movie, in the 1929 to 33 crash, the Fed did not create liquidity. And so you would have bank panic, which would create another bank panic, and it was like a string of dominoes. The money supply of the government the country shrank by about a third. About a third of the banks went under. Complete catastrophe. So you had what's called a deflationary depression. Stocks went down 90%. We had a daddy bear market in 2008, but it was a little over 50%. Recovery from 50% is a lot different. You have a 50% drop in your account. You need 100% to make it back. $1 million goes to $500,000. Now you got to double your money. That's not easy. But a 90% drop means you need 900% to make it back. It took 25 years to get back to the 1929 top. So that was catastrophic. And real estate went down about 80% over that time because you end up with forced liquidation. People lose their money. They lose their house. They got to sell stuff, and they sell into a weak market and on and on and on. It just rolls. It continues to compound on itself. What I think the likely next catastrophe will revolve around the government debt, which kind of brings up the political thing with Elizabeth Warren and stuff. We've gone from George Washington, where we had, almost no national debt. We had a little bit left over after the Revolutionary War. I say a little bit compared to today's numbers. We got to George W. Bush. We had $7 trillion in national debt accumulated. All the overspending the government's done for the entire time that it's been around. We're at $22 trillion and counting now, and that's with only about a third of the people in Medicare of the baby boomer generation. So 2/3 are not in Medicare, which is basically an unfunded pension, even though there's a vaunted trust fund. It's imaginary numbers. The Congress has already spent that money for that and Social Security. And so you got 2/3 of the boomers that are still not in there. At some point, you got to expect the liberals might win one of these elections, in which case they're getting more radical all the time. Trillions, $100 trillion worth of new spending. And they even have their own theory called modern monetary theory, which means we just print money all day, day and night. This is ruinous. It creates ruinous hyperinflation in the long run. So the only way I see them doing a monetary reform of any sort, and who knows what that's going to look like, it would happen after some kind of catastrophe like that, which right now, if I'm giving you my best guess, looks like it might occur like around 2030 would be a good guess. So I don't think it's going to happen in this cycle, but I don't see that you're even going to get any sort of monetary reform passed until a next crash catastrophe worse than 2008 probably But the bottom line is you also have to understand that the next decade, I think, is going to be, I don't see an alternative to very high inflation rates coming, which changes the investment environment completely. Again, simply because they've got all these unfunded mandates. The government has to spend money on mandatory programs. It's not the national defense. The interest on the debt will catch up to us when rates go back up. But the bottom line is it's government spending. Milton Friedman, my favorite economist of all time, said there's no such thing as a temporary government program. And so they pass all these deals, and then they continue to run amok. And we're at a crisis point of critical mass. Next time the left takes over, this thing blows the top off, and now you got $100 trillion of national debt or something. That's going to be the really big crisis.
That's why I have this little booklet on debt, because the first part of it is on federal debt before we talk about all the consumer debt. And it was interesting that Joe Biden just the other day sounded more like somebody out of the Heritage Foundation, or even sounded like Jerry Tuma, because at one point he says to Elizabeth Warren, you can get rid of the entire Defense Department, get rid of all the military, and you know how much that's going to fund the federal government? 4 months, And like, okay, we've been saying that. Jerry Tuma's been saying that.
Right.
That's sort of what we talk about in this booklet on debt, but we just, this is this la-la land right now. And it's
lunatic left is what I'm calling them now.
All the more reason for people to connect up with you, because a lot of people listen to this and saying, okay, I'm not sure what to do. I've got money in a 401k, or I wanted to put some money away for my kids' college fund, or I'm in debt and I want to try to figure out how to get out of debt but do the wise investments that I need to do and those kinds of things. And what about multiple streams of income? Because in Ecclesiastes 11, it talks about dividing your portion among 7 or more, even 8, because you don't know what the future holds.
Absolutely.
And so, again, I would encourage you to get together with a Christian financial planner, because he or she is going to be looking at that from a biblical point of view. And Jerry Tuma, that's why we always like people to connect up with you.
Appreciate that, Kerby. Thank you.
And again, the report is available. So it's on your website right now.
Well, it's actually not on the website. They have to give us their email address.
Okay.
We will not sell it to anyone else, and you won't get blasted with advertisements. But you'll permanently get on my mailing list. Anytime I'm publishing a report, from here on out, you'll get it automatically, but you do have to give us your email address.
Okay, so do that. And again, I'm holding it up right now, so I'm privileged to have one of the few copies. But if you want to get your own, it's called Don't Fight the Fed, and you're going to be having these coming out on a more regular basis.
The plan is to put one out every month with the exception of the holidays, and so we'll get more and more. That's why it's important for them to go ahead and sign up for this one by giving us their email address on our website, and then the next time I publish one, you'll automatically get that one in your email.
So again, if you want to find their website, it's on our website, pointofview.net, or just go to cornerstonefinancial.com. And I think you got it, right?
Yep.
Cornerstonereport.com. And again, all sorts of information on the website, so it's available to you. We come back from the break. Our good friend, Eric Metaxas, of course, we've talked with him about almost every one of his books on everything from Martin Luther to Bonhoeffer, Amazing Grace, Miracles, and much more. But we'll talk about a couple of his children's books as well. Donald Drains the Swamp, Donald Builds the Wall, and get his thoughts about the political campaigns unfolding before our very eyes. An author and also now a talk show host. Eric Metaxas with us right after these important messages.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of Medi-Share. Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We're going to get into some of the issues in the news, and if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Yesterday, there was a vote on the resolution, which really was an attempt to condemn or at least criticize, depending on which perspective you take, on the decision by the president to remove troops from Syria, as indeed Turkey is moving in and has been attacking the Kurds. Now, the vote was 354 to 60. And in just a minute, I'm going to kind of break down, first of all, how the vote went, how it led to, if you will, kind of some political theater in the White House. And I might just mention a little bit later, we're going to be talking with our friend Eric Metaxas. But let me just get into this in a little more detail. First of all, there were 225 Democrats, all of them, that voted for the resolution. Not a big surprise there. But it was instructive that it was by a 2-to-1 margin. Republicans had also voted for it, 129 to 60. And of that 129, a lot of them were Republican leaders, like Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, or the whip Steve Scalise, or the conference chair Liz Cheney. You also have some of these national security experts like Max Thornberry, who was a former chairman of Armed Services Committee, and Michael McCall of Foreign Affairs, and even a Marine veteran, Michael Gallagher, and others that all voted for this. And so this has caused a little bit of concern on the part of the president, in part because in the midst of all of this, you also have the impeachment investigation. And so let's first of all acknowledge what this is. It is, some people have called it a toothless resolution, in the fact that it gives Congress a chance to actually vote to condemn or criticize, whatever phrase you want to use, to disagree with the president's action. But it, of course, has no real force of law. So it's simply a resolution. But again, if indeed members of Congress really are concerned about the president's action, then you have a couple of comments I thought I might read. One comes from David Harsanyi, who says, if you want to stop Donald Trump from making unilateral decisions regarding war and peace, then stop letting all presidents making unilateral decisions about war and peace. It's really that quite simple. Or the Washington Times editorial board put it this way: if Congress is so adamant that U.S. forces should be fighting in the Syrian civil war, then Congress should vote to declare war. That's not going to happen. When's the last time we declared war? It's called World War II. Everything else has been some kind of military action. Now let's, for the moment, acknowledge what the resolution is saying, and that is, should we be there? And that is really always been a little bit tenuous. The justification for even having military there is based upon what's called the authorization for the use of military force. Now, that was passed after 9/11, and it certainly does give the president the power to deploy troops against terrorists or associated forces. That would certainly apply to al-Qaeda. It was a bit of a stretch to apply it to ISIS because that really wasn't the intent of the law, but okay, maybe we could cover it there. But it's even more tenuous to say that it applies to our actions in Syria. If you listened to our program yesterday, we did give you an opportunity if you wanted to give to help Syrian refugees. We mentioned one organization. You can pick others as well. And it has not been helpful to the president or to his supporters that he's been a little too cavalier with some of the criticism. By the way, just a few miles from where we're broadcasting right now, the president's going to have a rally here in Dallas. This is the second one he's held this year. Lots of people have been sitting outside of the American Airlines Center to go and hear him tonight. And I'm sure a lot of them are very supportive of him. At the same time, even those people that have been very supportive of the president have not been very supportive of this desire to withdraw troops from Syria. And I'm sure he will address it tonight, and maybe we'll have a chance to hear some of his comments tomorrow. But when the president has talked about the Middle East, he's made statements like, it's a lot of sand they can play with. That's not helpful. We have a situation where Turkey is taking land from Syria, and Syria is not happy about it. Let them work it out. We shouldn't be over there. And it's just not that simple, because if nothing else, we have to recognize that we have Turkey, we have Syria, we have the Kurds. Now, again, as you will see in just a minute, the president sometimes is simply referred to the Kurds as a terrorist group or having at least terrorist actions or those kinds of things. And that's probably overstated as well. The PKK and the YPG. And yet there are some that have wondered whether or not there may be some things behind the scenes. And both Mark Alexander in the piece I'm looking at right now, as well as Gary Bauer yesterday, mentioned that we've got to understand the possibility behind the scenes that Turkey, which is a NATO ally, whether you like it or not, Turkey is part of NATO. It is a NATO ally. Whether they maybe even gave the president advance warning that they were going to come in against the PKK, which are part of the Kurds. And because of that, whether or not they gave him a heads up, basically saying, we're coming in, so you can either leave your troops there and they will be hit by our troops, at the very least with collateral damage, or we can't even guarantee that they won't attack you too, or you can leave. And so there is at least a possibility that there could have been some kind of threat or even some kind of, if you will, diplomatic option saying, we're coming in, whether you're going to be there or not. You choose what you want to do. And the president probably thought this is a good time to pull out the various military, which are there primarily not as anything more than doing some observation. They are in some ways involved, but not necessarily fighting on a day-to-day basis. And so that may be an explanation. Another one that Gary Bauer simply mentioned was NATO has access to our nuclear weapons, which were placed in Turkey as a deterrent against the Soviet Union. And so there could be some issues there, which we might want to think about as well. But before we go to a break, let me just mention that this led also to a big meltdown and a lot of political theater, because these various members of Congress, and this is Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and all sorts of people going to the White House. Nancy Pelosi says that Trump had a meltdown. Trump says Pelosi was acting like a third-rate politician. Although the way we're acting, it was kind of like grade school. Some people jokingly said, I wonder if he didn't say a third-grade politician. And so she stormed out. They stormed out. The microphones were already there. You wonder if it was somewhat of a planned attack. And then she started talking about things like he was unhinged. He was having a meltdown. I pray for the president all the time. Now I have to pray for his health because it's a very serious meltdown on the part of the president. And whether that might even be used as another justification for impeachment. And so I just recognize that there's a fair amount of political theater that takes place in Washington, D.C., and that's perhaps part of the explanation for it. But it all had to do with that vote yesterday, 354 to 60, agreeing with a resolution to express disapproval of Donald Trump's shifting of troops in Syria. When we come back, we'll see if we can connect up with Eric Metaxas and get some of his comments. We'll be back right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In my commentaries, I often refer to the millennial generation, but what does the term millennial really mean? According to John Quiggin, millennial means nothing. That's the title of his op-ed in the New York Times. He is onto something. Some social commentators make broad statements about a particular cohort of people, baby boomers, baby busters, or millennials, and as we know, for any general rule, there are bound to be exceptions. That is why he rejects what he calls the generation game. That is the insistence on dividing society into groups based upon birth year. When I wrote a book years ago on baby boomers, and when I speak at various venues today about the millennial generation, I always talk about the fact that the trends we see are general rules. I even say that if you know millennials, you may notice that the trends I'm talking about don't necessarily apply to them. If you are a millennial, you may say some of the trends don't apply to you. Once we have this disclaimer, it then seems fair to at least notice general trends within a generation. After all, people born in the 1950s grew up in a time of unprecedented economic expansion. Young people born after the year 2000 grew up in a time when America was at war with terrorists. Even though there are important differences within a particular generation, they all have some common social experiences. And I believe that one factor that really binds a generation together is the shared technological experiences. Computers, the internet, video games, and smartphones have had a profound influence on the millennial generation and the following generation, often called iGen. In many ways, the common experience unifies a cohort like never before. That is why I'm not ready to say millennial means nothing. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, going to be talking with our good friend Eric Metaxas. I was just thinking about the first time we met. That was 3 radio studios ago. He was talking about his book, Everything You Wanted to Know About God But Were Afraid to Ask. And then came Amazing Grace, as well as Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther, If You Can Keep It, Miracles. But of course, we also have known him over the years as an individual that's actually written 30 different children's books. As we get closer to Thanksgiving, I always recommend Squanto and the Miracle of Thanksgiving, as well as his book, A Time to Sleep. But he also has had a little bit of fun more recently about some of the political debate, and we have Donald Drains the Swamp and Donald Builds the Wall. So not only a New York Times best-selling author, but also the host of the Eric Metaxas Show. Eric Metaxas, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Oh, my goodness. It is my privilege. It's great to hear your voice, and thanks for having me on to talk about my nakedly silly book. It is openly and explicitly silly, but that's the goal, to make people laugh. Well, maybe we'll learn something, too.
Yes, well, and again, for people saying, well, he's writing children's books, well, he was writing children's books. You were writing Veggie Tales. You've got the most eclectic background.
I've written 30 children's books. Kirby, if you can believe it, I've written 30 children's books over the years. Most people don't know me for that. Most people know me for my Bonhoeffer book, which is as big as they get, and my Luther book, and my Amazing Grace book on Wilberforce, or I wrote a book on miracles, and If You Can Keep It. Those are my adult books, but I have written many children's books, and I've done a lot of children's books with my favorite children's book author. His name is Tim Ragland. We did a book called Uncle Muggsy and the Terrible Twins of Christmas, and we did a book called Yankee Doodle Muggsy. And when this president was elected, I thought, holy cow, I think Tim Ragland and I need to do a fun book about the phenomenon of this president. So that's what we set out to do, and now we've done 2 of them.
And again, let me just mention Uncle Muggsy's one, The Terrible Twins of Christmas, and some of the others. These are just great children's books. And you know what? Now, my wife and I actually have one granddaughter, so that fits in this. But again, these are thinly veiled because you have, of course, Donald looks a lot like Donald Trump, and then you have problems with some of these negative people that come in, MSNBC 3T, that made me laugh.
I have to explain so people don't think we're just nuts. I mean, these
is
are
crazy. Yes.
Funny books for adults. They look like kids' books, but adults will laugh more than kids. But they really do work as kids' books. You know, kids won't get the adult humor, but it's the first one is Donald Drains the Swamp.
Right.
It's about a caveman named Donald, and all the cave people are upset because their king lives in the middle of a big swamp, and he's out of touch. He doesn't talk to them. He doesn't help them. He only cares about the swamp creatures. And in order to talk to the king, you've got to live in the swamp. And Donald goes over one day, and he finds out, holy cow, the whole swamp is made of money. No wonder it's green. No wonder nobody leaves the swamp, and he doesn't talk to people outside the swamp. So he realizes, you know, he's a builder of caves, Donald. He's a builder of caves. And he says, well, this is simple. We're just going to dig a big trench and drain the swamp. So they start draining the swamp, and of course the swamp creatures get angry. One of the swamp creatures looks oddly like Senator Chuck Schumer. Another one is a turtle, might look like Mitch McConnell depending on how closely you look. You know, so it's a bipartisan swamp, and he drains the swamp, and the money runs out. And suddenly, all of the swamp creatures and the king chase after the money to the horizon, never to be seen again, because they just want to go where the money is. So the swamp is drained, and the people get their country back, so to speak, and they want to make Donald king. And he says, no, you're a free people now. You don't want a king. A king tells people what to do. A free people, they tell their leaders what to do. And they say, oh, you mean like a president? He goes, yeah, and if that's what you're looking for, I'm your caveman. So that's the first book. Donald is, you know, like George Washington. They want to make him king, and he says no. And so it's fun because it teaches kids what it means to drain the swamp and what does it mean to take your government back. It's a fable, basically. It works on all levels. But the second book is called Donald Builds the Wall, and it makes sense because the land of the free is now prospering, and suddenly everybody wants to go there because who wants to live in a place ruled by a corrupt king when you can go to a place that is free? So lots of people show up, but eventually some people show up that aren't interested in freedom. They just want to get what they can get. And so some trouble ensues, and that's when they decide to build a wall with a big door so they can vet the people. The people, if you love freedom, you can come in. If you don't, you can't come in. But there's also a character, kind of an AOC character, an angry little girl who notices that the cave people in this prosperous place called the land of the free, they're so prosperous, they're inventing things. The free market is working, and they've invented fire and cooking and the wheel. And she says the smoke from fires is toxic. It's we're all going to go extinct. People are not supposed to breathe that stuff, and we've got to wipe it out. She's got a big plan called the Green Raw Deal.
Oh, yes.
And it's really silly. And then there's a vicious gang, a very vicious gang, called MSNBC 13. So, as you know, it's thinly veiled political satire, but it's not mean-spirited. I think you can give it to somebody who hates this president, and they'll still laugh because it's done in good fun. But I think we need to laugh, and you know me, Kirby, I love to laugh, so I wouldn't write for VeggieTales and do what I do.
And again, you got somebody who looks like
important.
Bernie Sanders, somebody who looks like AOC, you got the Rhinoceros and all the rest. But I'd like to get your comments on this for just a minute because you are basing this on some reality, and you've watched, I would imagine, 3 or 4 of these Democrat debates. We've got another one coming up in November. And your perspective for just a minute, because I have been around for a while politically, you have as well, and I don't think I've ever seen such radical leftist kind of ideas coming out of the mouths of so many candidates.
Of course, we've never even come close to it. They make McGovern look like Ronald Reagan. This is absolutely madness, and it's why my crazy theory, I've been saying this for a long time, for many, many months, is that eventually the heads of the party are going to realize none of these people can defeat Trump, and they're going to need to go outside and find somebody else. And I believe they're going to drag Hillary Clinton back in to save America. She will lose, but I really think that they're going to try to find somebody with big name recognition who they think this time she's our best shot. I really think that things have gone so off the rails. It can be very healthy for the country in a way because it shows us the radical side of the leftists. The masks and the gloves have come off. We see them as they are. And I think that's very, very important for America, that we recognize that the left has always been leaning in this direction. And now, because of the provocations of this president, they have just gone absolutely crazy and have really shown themselves to be genuine leftists who are the enemies of the most basic ideas of American freedom and self-government and everything that we stand for and have stood for nearly 2.5 centuries. They aren't fans of that, and so now we see that fairly clearly. But it's a real madness, and I'm glad that most Americans see it, I think.
Well, again, we have a link to your website, ericmetaxas.com, so people can find that. But one of the things I wanted to say is after you were gone, I was going to maybe read and have in a previous program Michael Starr Hopkins in The Hill. And this is an individual that has worked in the Obama campaign, the Clinton campaign, even in the John Delaney campaign, which didn't go anywhere. And the title is Democrats Have Reason to Worry About the Last Presidential Debate. And what he sort of does, and you can appreciate this having lived up in the Northeast, and of course I lived in Connecticut for a while there as well, and that is the last time you've had liberal progressive candidates from Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, John Kerry, running against, in one case, George Herbert Walker Bush, another one, George W. Bush, didn't do so well. So if your next candidate is Elizabeth Warren, another liberal progressive individual from Massachusetts who has a little bit of trouble relating to the average person, that might not work so well. And it's kind of like, I've seen this story before. I don't want to watch it again.
Well, it's even more dramatic this time because Elizabeth Warren is far more leftist than anybody we've had before. You're talking about a Dukakis or McGovern or anybody. She is much more dramatically left. And I think she has big personal problems. I mean, the fact that she spent, decades pretending to be an American Indian to put her career forward and that kind of thing. I mean, that's embarrassing. And, of course, in a campaign, that's going to come out more and more and more and more. And I really don't think that they have fielded any kind of a candidate who can defeat this president. And I think that, we're in such an interesting time. It's honestly, Kerby, it's why Tim and I wrote these books, because I said things are so divisive. We've got to laugh, and we've got to be able to celebrate what the president is doing. Even if you're not a fan of his, the idea that he wants us to have borders, the idea that he calls things what they are, the idea that he's trying to drain the swamp, that he's talking about corruption, I have to say that, that it makes me happy. And I think a lot of Americans they're cheered up by it. They see something good happening. And I thought,
yes,
instead of buying a Make America Great Again hat, or maybe you've got 3 of those, you want something funny or fun that you can share. And I thought we don't really have anything on our side like that. There are a lot of angry liberal books against the president. They look like kids' books, but they're not. So I did what I could.
Yes, well, again, the books, Donald Drains the Swamp, Donald Builds the Wall. Let me see if I can keep you for another minute or two, but we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. We'll be right back.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. And, of course, we have Eric Metaxas with us for just a few more minutes because I wanted to ask him a couple more questions. One of those relates to an event happening tonight, just a few miles from where we're broadcasting right now. Donald Trump will be speaking to a rally at the American Airlines Center. And I've been watching people that have been camping out there sometimes for days. It looks like a Thanksgiving, all of the people wanting to get into these shops on Black Friday, but it's just amazing how many people are out there, the excitement that is there. And so I thought for just a minute, Eric, we always love to hear from people that have met the president. I've never met Donald Trump. A lot of our listeners never will. But you have, and I've heard a number of people say that the caricature that is created of him by the media is not the person that you've met in the Oval Office. Can you tell us a little bit more about him?
Well, I have to say that the people that know him well, better than I do, say things about him that you don't typically hear in the media. For example, Judge Jeanine Pirro, she was on my radio program. Actually, I think we're going to air it tomorrow. But I had a long conversation with her where she talks to me about knowing this president for 30 years when the kids were small. And she says he was always a great father, not just a good father, always gracious, always going into the kitchen in a restaurant to praise the staff. The kinds of things that I have heard other people say, but to hear it from somebody who really knew him and still knows him, it's very different from the picture you get. There's a level of graciousness toward the working man, which I have to say says a lot as far as I'm concerned. You know, if somebody is genuinely gracious to people to whom they don't have to be gracious, you know, that's the idea of grace, right? I hear that over and over again. In my brief encounters with him, he's been extremely gracious and friendly and open with his time. I mean, I'm amazed at that he's not the kind of person that doesn't want to talk and just, you know, wants to hustle off to the next important thing. So it really is interesting. And I think, Kerby, it gets to the point, you know, of why I wrote these books in a way, is that I think that there is almost nothing positive said about this president in the culture, unless maybe you're, you know, watching conservative news or something like that. But the facts are rather different. And I think most Americans voted for him, and most Americans, of course, don't believe in be some kind of a monster. And I think we need to celebrate what he's done. But it gets very hard when the media is monolithically, viciously against him. I mean, you can criticize him all day long. It's the United States of America. We have every right to do that. But the level of vitriol is really unpleasant, and it has twisted things. I mean, I look at the New York Times every day, and I have to say, living here in New York, they don't even try to present anything fairly. And it's very dismaying. It's very, very dismaying. So I think that it's really important that we take everything we hear with a grain of salt. I get the impression, one thing that's very important to me, two things. First of all, I get the impression he loves his family and that his family love him. That's a pretty big thing. That's hard to fake if you're some kind of a monster. But his kids obviously really love him and respect him, and that says a lot. And then it seems clear to me he loves his country. That's big. That's a big thing. It's important that we have a president who loves his country, who cares about it, who cares about its future, and, you know, in doing deals with China, for example, is fighting for the country. That's a huge thing, and it's almost remarkable, isn't it, that we would have to think about that, because you think, well, that's the job of the chief executive. But I think Trump said it at some press conference. Imagine if we had Joe Biden negotiating with China, which has, you know, lined his son's pockets, and, you know, we can talk about whether that's legal or illegal, but the question is, what does it do to you when you are involved with a country that you're supposed to be super tough with them, but they've kind of, you know, maybe they haven't actually bribed you, but they've made life a little easier for you. The fact is we have a president who really is negotiating hard with a country that, let's be honest, we ought to have been negotiating hard with them for the last 30 years. We've failed. Our leaders have failed horribly, shamefully, very, very shamefully. So finally we have a president, if he's doing nothing else, he's making a tough deal with China. That's, if you really think about it, when you think of the size of the economy of China and our economy, what a huge thing that is. That's not just one thing on a long list. It's a very important thing for our future. And so I have to say hats off to this president for all that. I think the impeachment situation is a political circus. It's political theater. It's nonsense. And we really have to understand that it's very silly, and it's people playing political games that they're entitled to play, but I don't believe that they will win.
Let me also just mention that if you'd like to know more about Eric Metaxas, of course, we have a link to his website, and don't have to spell that anymore because his fame, everybody knows how to spell his name now, but it's there. And we also have a link to Instagram, Facebook, all sorts of things, Twitter. As a matter of fact, Facebook, I saw you were celebrating your anniversary with your wife, but I also saw that you were on a program that brings us back to China, because I did not want to let you go before you had to say something, or probably would like to say something about the way in which certain NBA stars, we can think about LeBron James and what you call the silence from the sidelines for these individuals that have been critical of this country, so critical of this president, and there have been some reasons to be critical of this country. I'm with you. Then all of a sudden get real silent about real terrible abuses that have been taking place in China. Go ahead.
Well, look, there were people in the 1930s, you got to understand, and into the 40s, who said we have no business criticizing Hitler because we've got problems right here. And I think to myself, you know what? We might have problems right here, but if you don't have the brains and the discernment and the courage to call out evil when you see evil, you never have any business criticizing your own country. There are things going on in China, like the harvesting of the organs of prisoners. They can say, you're a political prisoner, you're a Christian, we don't like you, you go in prison, something happens to you, you die, and guess what? We'd love to have your organs because the people, the premier people in the party have illnesses and they get first dibs on your organs. It's the kind of thing, it's like out of a bad dystopian novel. That's happening in China. They have no religious liberty. The Uyghur Muslims are literally in concentration camps. 1 million Uyghur Muslims are in concentration camps for the crime of their ethnicity, even more than their faith. There are horrible things. And when you say, you know what, I don't care. I just want to make a buck. I want to get the NBA into there, and we're going to have, we're going to be on easy street making billions of dollars off of that big economy. That means that you've sold your soul. You don't care about anything. I talked about this on Shannon Bream the other night. I put it on my Twitter feed and on my Facebook page. If people are following me on Twitter or on Facebook, they'll see it. And every week at my own website, it's just ericmetaxas.com. You can sign up to get a weekly e-blast where I link to everything I've done that week, all my interviews and everything, but including this kind of stuff. And I even interviewed, I don't know if you realize, I interviewed Caroline Kennedy in Chicago a week ago at a Socrates in the City event. And, of course, we differ politically. It was a very interesting conversation, and I think we're going to get that video up sometime tomorrow or this weekend. So a lot of interesting stuff. In case people are interested, they can just go to my website, ericmetaxas.com, and sign up for the weekly e-blast, because I try to put everything there so people don't have to go searching for it. But the NBA thing, I get very hot-headed about that. And on the other night on Shannon Bream, I was just I simply can't believe the level of ignorance on the part of many leaders. They're making a lot of money, and they don't know anything about what it means to be an American. They don't know anything about the freedoms that we have, that we don't deserve these freedoms. We don't deserve the wealth and the blessings and the opportunity. And it's a gift from God, and we are meant to use it for God's purposes, to help those who don't have those things, like the people in Hong Kong and the people in China. If he can't do that, it's just a grievous situation. So I will speak out about it every chance I get. I've been tweeting about it and putting things about it on Facebook and talking about it on my own radio program. I really think it's a moment for Americans to wake up to what we have, to appreciate what we have. With all our problems, we could never really be compared to a totalitarian dictatorship like China.
And again, I'll just mention that we have a link to that Facebook page, which just look at your picture there. We have Facebook and Twitter, as well as, of course, a link directly to the website. And then you can see the interview that he did with Shannon Bream. And I knew you'd been talking about LeBron James. We were talking about it the other day, and I wanted to get your comments about it as well. So, Eric Metaxas, just always been great to count you as a great friend. And I'm just sorry that because you're doing your show, we don't get you on this program very often, but people can hear you, of course, at the Eric Metaxas Show, and it's just great to have you on the program, and thanks for staying with us a little bit longer. So we'll say goodbye and see you next time.
My privilege. Thank you so much, Kerby. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Again, Donald drains the swamp, and Donald builds the wall, and these would be fun children's books, but like Veggie Tales, the adults get a lot of the humor, even if the kids don't. So it works at both levels. We'll come back with some final comments right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. I thought you'd enjoy that conversation with Eric Metaxas. He didn't connect up with us right away, so he's gracious enough to stay around a little bit longer. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about what he does, we have links to his website, to Facebook page, and Twitter feed. And we were just talking about this afterwards. I think he's been in all four of the studios, because when I first met him, we were in the studio that was originally built by Marlon Maddox, and we talked about the book, Everything You Wanted to Know About God. I think I ought to tell the story about him for just a second before we get back into some of this. In that particular book, I think there was a follow-up, Everything You Wanted to Know About God, Part 2, and I think that's actually when I ran into him, when he'd had that second book. he mentioned something about William Wilberforce when he was on a CNN interview, and it's just like a paragraph, really, in the book, but he said everything he knew about it, and almost immediately there was somebody that called and said, I saw that you had written about William Wilberforce. And he said, well, actually very little, but yes, I have. And he said, well, we've got this film coming out called Amazing Grace, and it's about William Wilberforce. We were just wondering if you would want to expand that into a book. And he said, yeah, and he'd not really ever done a biography before, but wrote Amazing Grace. And that really started to change everything. By that time, of course, he'd already been doing the Breakpoint commentaries, and he had, of course, had a lot of the children's books out. And, of course, people knew him for some of the things that he had done with Veggie Tales and the rest. But then that turned into another book, Bonhoeffer. Then he wasn't really thinking he would ever maybe do another book on a biography. But then later on, of course, wrote Martin Luther. Of course, If You Can Keep It is all about kind of American history, miracles, which then he actually used to write an article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, which is one of the most reprinted articles ever. And, of course, then Salem came to him and said, would you like to host a show out of New York? And, of course, that's the Eric Metaxas Show. So I've kind of watched the growth over these years, including, interestingly enough, having a chance to speak at the National Prayer Breakfast. So he's doing very well, and we wish him well. And his wife, Suzanne and he have celebrated, I think it was their 25th anniversary or something like that. And you can see all of that on the website that is there at pointofview.net. For just a few minutes, though, I did mention with him this article by Michael Starr Hopkins. And Michael Starr Hopkins is an individual that actually has served on the presidential campaigns for President Barack Obama, for Senator Hillary Clinton when she ran for president, and then even more recently for John Delaney. Of course, that one didn't go very well. But the title of it is striking. Democrats have reason to worry after the last presidential debate. And he's a Democrat. He wants to get one of the Democrats in office. He wants to get rid of Donald Trump. But here's what he says. He said, if Democrats want to beat President Trump in 2020 and return a sense of normalcy to the White House, they may want to make sure that the current frontrunners are up to the job at hand. Winning a primary, he says, is one thing, but winning a general election is a completely different beast. When the top three candidates are self-avowed socialist, a former vice president mired in a scandal, and a quasi-populist at war with Wall Street, it's fair to say that there's room for concern. So let's take each one. And matter of fact, he never even mentions Biden. He just mentions the vice president. So that one doesn't even show up. So I think he's convinced that's a done deal. So he says Elizabeth Warren could potentially be the best candidate and the worst candidate to take Trump on in the general election. She is clearly thoughtful, extremely smart, prepared to lean into the historic moment that her candidacy presents. But like Hillary Clinton, she has yet to find her voice or ability to create a likable narrative that will drive apathetic Democrats to the polls on Election Day. And so then he goes and compares her as a progressive liberal from Massachusetts to two other progressive liberal senators from Massachusetts. Well, one's a governor, and that's Michael Dukakis, and the other, of course, was Senator John Kerry. And he says, this is what scares me, he says. The weakness of Dukakis and Kerry were not rooted in their policy proposals. I slightly disagree about that, but let's give him his point. It was rooted in their inability to connect with voters who had different life experiences. Whether it was a person of color or a blue-collar voter, both Dukakis and Kerry failed to connect. The current field cannot afford to make the same mistakes. Now, I do disagree a little bit on policy because I think there's some evidence to suggest that the reason George W. Bush won states like Ohio is because they had also a vote on the Marriage Protection Amendment, which defined marriage between one man and one woman. That is something that George W. Bush endorsed. That's something that John Kerry did not. A lot of people in Ohio might have said, I'm not sure I feel like I want to advance the LGBT agenda. And John Kerry is going to do that. George W. Bush is not. And by the way, that also had difficulty connecting with people that are African American, a lot of whom are churchgoers and have at least some kind of traditional views about marriage, or even sort of blue-collar voters. So the point he's making is that those individuals do have some problems in the past, and if that's a preview of coming attractions for Elizabeth Warren, Not sure we want to go there. Then he takes on the fact that Beto O'Rourke and Cory Booker have failed to live up to their expectations and squandered their opportunities to turn their visions into tangible movements. Candidates like Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris have so far been unable to expand their base and build upon their name recognition to solidly build their support. So that's kind of what they talk about. But one other article that also appeared in The Hill, this one comes from Jonathan Easley and Amy Parnas, basically talks about the fact that if there is a threat for some of the front runners, it's coming from the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. That's Mayor Pete Buttigieg, because they said he's fresh off of an eye-opening debate performance, positioning himself to be the top contender for the support of the centrist Democrats that up until now have sort of supported the former vice president. He's done pretty well in terms of fundraising, has $23 million in the bank. To put that in perspective, Beto O'Rourke, I just mentioned a minute ago, has like $3 million in the bank for his campaign. I think Julian Castro has $1 million. I just happen to know those because they're in Texas, and so I know some of those numbers. But they also said that the mayor has picked up a number of points in some of the most recent polls, which means now he's in third place in Iowa, within striking distance of Senator Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden. So it is possible that he may actually surface as another contender. And, of course, I've written about the way in which I think he misuses Scripture and the rest, but certainly he showed himself to be a formidable opponent when he actually went after Beto O'Rourke over his mandatory gun buyback, went after Warren over her Medicare for All. And I loved at one point when Beto was kind of using the typical kind of progressive idea, well, I care about the people, you don't, kind of implication. And he said, look, you don't have to actually lecture me about courage, because after all, you know, Mayor Pete actually has served in the military. And so it was kind of interesting to see that kind of reaction as well. So we'll see how this plays out. And a lot of it will depend, I suspect, on the next debate. That's not until next month, so we'll be talking about that when we get a little bit closer. First of all, there's going to be a weeding out. At the moment, only 8 of those candidates will qualify for the next debate. And so right now you had 12, next time 8, and we'll see whether or not they even continue in terms of the polling, because as some people rise, other people fall. So it's quite possible that even though you have 8 qualifying now, you could end up just with 7 or 6, and then it becomes a much more interesting race. And, of course, all of this happening before the first caucus or the first primary. So we'll be paying attention to that as well. Well, we'll see what some of the roundtable wants to discuss tomorrow, and that will be done by our good friend Dr. Merrill Matthews, who'll be sitting in for me. And we certainly look forward to you joining us every single day. If you find yourself saying, I want to know a little bit more about what Jerry Tuma had to say, I want to know more about Eric Metaxas' books, they're all available at our website, pointofview.net. And if you click on that button that says donate, we would certainly appreciate and value your financial support. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day, and we will see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of Medi-Share. Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.